Hey everyone, let's discuss Akkermansia Muciniphila, a new probiotic, juxtapose some of the claims about this probiotic against the evidence, and attempt to come away with a practical, reasonable, and scientifically informed perspective on Akkermansia. And just to share sort of my perspective going into reviewing the research here, I tend to be constitutionally suspicious. And the reason for this is early in my career, I may have had, you could say, rose-colored glasses on, where I assumed everything in natural health was good and effective and could do no harm. Over the years, and upon fact-checking many products, claims, tests, etc., I've more often than not become disappointed, which is why the perspective I take with you is one that's more guarded, certainly open-minded and wanting to explore any therapeutic that could alleviate suffering and optimize health, but also seeing how many people can waste money or chase a frivolous diagnosis and suffer sort of the psychological turmoil that is connected to that. I try to be scrupulous with fact-checking the things that we discuss and delivering to you a reasonable and evidence-informed perspective when we have due evidence. As I've said many a time, there are some areas in healthcare where there's not much research and clinicians are kind of in the trenches doing the best that they can and trying to take anecdotes and use those to inform how to practice. Nevertheless, let's review Akkermansia and give you what I feel to be the most reasonable perspective on this new and potentially novel probiotic. Welcome to Dr. Ruscio Radio, providing practical, science-based insights into health. We break through the bias and the noise to bring you simple, trustworthy information that matters. A few definitions. What is Akkermansia? It's a commensal bacteria, so it's normal to the human gut. Discovered in 2004 by Muriel Darien and colleagues at the University of Netherlands. And one of the things here that might be interesting is that it lives in the mucus lining of the gut and can therefore interact with the immune cells and perhaps has more benefit. But this is where we want to be a little bit careful not to take something interesting mechanistically and draw assumptions from that. Now, while we're on sort of the topic of mechanism, because it can live in the gut lining, Akkermansia tends to use mucus to then produce short-chain fatty acids. Now, again, this sounds really good because if you know anything about short-chain fatty acids, these are fuel for the enterocytes or for the intestinal cells. However, there are some conditions, as an example, some subsets of IBS that have too much short-chain fatty acids. Some populations that are overweight may have too much short-chain fatty acid. So just want to be careful again to contextualize that mechanism doesn't automatically translate to something that's clinically helpful. But again, because of where Akkermansia resides, it can or may support the gut barrier and make the gut barrier thicker. And also it has metabolic implications in that Akkermansia stimulates GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1. And as you can imagine, with glucagon being a fasting hormone, it's associated with promotion of satiety and lowering of blood sugar. So there's sort of the background context. Now let's look at some of the claims in terms of what might it do to help you and fact check those against the data. Because probiotics, as we've been discussing on the show for quite a while now, are a pretty remarkable tool. There is a lot of research categorically on probiotics demonstrating benefit across a wide array of conditions. So this is where I think the fact-checking is going to be quite helpful. And by the way, if this has been helpful, please subscribe, comment, and if there's one person you think this might help, please share it. Okay, so coming to the Akkermansia claims. The first one, and the one that might be the most novel, is that Akkermansia is the only strain that lives in and regulates the gut lining. This sounds fantastic. It's actually incorrect. And pretty quickly we can pull up, for example, a 2022 study that found 25 species that live in the lining of the gut. And there's even a term for this already, the Mucosa-Associated microbiome. So that's one claim that I think is pretty easy to set the record straight on, it does live in the lining of the gut. It's definitely not the only species that lives in the lining of the gut. The second claim is that Akkermansia is a major part of the gut microbiome. I feel this claim to be misleading, and let me give you the data that informs my perspective on this. The total gut microbiome contains 1 to 5% Akkermansia. Comparatively, it contains 2 to 14% of bifidobacteria. Additionally, if we zoom in on the small intestine, which for reasons we've elaborated on ad nauseum in the past, is probably the most important area of the gut since you absorb 90 to 95% of calories there. This is where you have the most opportunity and the most leaky gut that can occur, the most immune activation, the most gut receptors. It's really the most important area of the gut. Not to say the other areas are not important, but again, nutrient absorption, immune regulation are predominantly occurring here. So Akkermansia here represents less than 0.5% of the microbiome, and then comparatively, lactobacillus represent 6% of the small intestinal microbiome. So to say it's a major regulator, maybe, but I think it's a bit of a stretch. And if someone were to hear that claim, they might think, oh, well, if it's a major regulator, it's got to be better than the other probiotic that I'm currently taking that might contain lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. And when we represent it as such, I think it's more correct to say it's a part. I wouldn't say it's a major part. And then another claim here is that Akkermansia levels being low is associated with poor health. And again, this is misleading. It's really only giving you part of the data set here. Yes, lower levels of Akkermansia have been associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and inflammatory bowel disease. But conversely, higher levels have been associated with irritable bowel syndrome, with Parkinson's, and with multiple sclerosis. So this harkens back to a concept I had written about in Healthy Gut, Healthy You years ago, which is we should be careful not to micromanage an ecosystem and not say, well, some healthy populations and cohorts have higher Akkermansia. Now we're just going to target Akkermansia and try to increase it or decrease it. And I think that misses the bigger picture of the ecosystem that is the gut. And I'll reinforce that concept here more in just a moment. But let's now go to Akkermansia and its impact on metabolism and its impact on gut health, or the claims that Akkermansia is pro-metabolic, if you will, and promotes gut health. I feel these claims to be partially true, although there are a couple of caveats. The data are really early, and in some cases, I feel that the data are ahead of what the science is showing. Huge credit here to our research team for distilling this down into a table. And if you're just listening to this, I'll of course narrate. But what you're seeing here is a comparative table looking at one trial, so one randomized control trial that administered Akkermansia plus a few other species like Clostridium butyricum. We're going to compare that to a meta-analysis of 15 clinical trials that administered lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend type probiotics. So this is not an apple-to-apple comparison. It's a meta-analysis versus one clinical trial. Nevertheless, you see equivalent results comparing the probiotics regarding hemoglobin A1C impact. That's the average of your blood sugar over roughly 2 months. You see superior results with the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend type of probiotic for both fasting glucose and for insulin resistance. So that's blood sugar. Moving on to lipids, weight loss, and leaky gut. Here we can compare one randomized control trial administering Akkermansia alone, comparing this to lactobacillus and, again, bifidobacterium probiotic research, wherein we have 2 meta-analyses summarizing 51 clinical trials. You see equivalency for impacts on LDL cholesterol. You see better results with the Akkermansia for triglycerides and for weight loss. And you see better results with the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend probiotics for leaky gut, in the sense that there's more data showing that the lacto-bifido blend probiotics can improve LPS, a direct marker of leaky gut, can improve zonulin via blood testing, and lactose mannitol ratio testing. Taken collectively, interesting to see some of these impacts from Akkermansia, and hopefully further data will reinforce that there's this sort of pro-metabolic effect, at least pertaining to triglycerides and to weight loss. That being said, I should acknowledge that there's something known as a positive publication bias. For new therapeutics, papers tend to get granted access for publication when they're showing a positive finding, because it's more interesting. So when a therapeutic is new, there tends to be one or a couple positive studies that first appear in the research journals. And then with more time, you see a better sampling where you'll have some of the null finding or some negative studies. And this is why this comparison is so salient, because we're looking at one, in both comparison tables here, one randomized control trial compared to 20 to 50 randomized control trials. A real world analogy for this would be if you had a friend who went to a restaurant and this person really loved the restaurant. Well, that's one person's perspective. You may or may not agree with your friend's perspective, but if you asked 50 people what they thought of the restaurant, you would get a more accurate representation of what the experience at the restaurant was likely to be because you had a larger sample. So again, interesting. And I would not say by any stretch this means we're disqualifying Akkermansia as something to potentially try. But I would be bridled with the claims that represent this as super novel on the gut and this really important, almost Ozempic-like probiotic due to the impact on GLP-1 and therefore on metabolism. Interesting, but I think we're still a little bit early sort of in this conversation. I wanted to make sure to point out to you, we have other probiotic research, really meta-analyses on either lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend probiotics or Saccharomyces boulardii or soil-based probiotics. So meta-analyses showing improvements in leaky gut, IBS, IBD, constipation, SIBO, and depression. So again, it's not to take anything away from Akkermansia, but my concern is that you may be hit with claims about Akkermansia that represent it as being better than the current probiotics that we have. And I just don't see the case for that. Now, again, it's not to say you couldn't trial the Akkermansia, but I want you to have a balanced perspective on what the research is showing. Additionally, there are ways that you can naturally increase Akkermansia that do not require you to take Akkermansia as a supplement. And this comes back to the ecosystem analogy, meaning as a general observation, things that improve host health tend to improve the richness and diversity and balance of the microbiota. So if we intervene upstream and do things that are health promoting, sleep, exercise, stress management, fermented food consumption, healthy diet regarding polyphenols, fiber, proteins, fats, then we tend to see these downstream impacts of a healthy microbiota. And we can even add to that probiotic supplementation. So let me loop in a few things here. Firstly, 2 studies have shown that eating a diet rich in prebiotics, so these are the things that feed bacteria, prebiotics and FODMAPs actually increase Akkermansia levels. So on the one hand, this is great. If you eat essentially more fruits and vegetables, then you can feed your gut bacteria and see improvements in Akkermansia levels. However, as we've discussed many times on the show in the past, especially if someone has gut symptoms, a diet high in fruits and vegetables, and most specifically prebiotics and FODMAPs, might flare their symptoms and be deleterious for their microbiota. And this is where a wonderful 2022 meta-analysis in the journal Gut from Chris Black and colleagues at the University of Leeds is very relevant. And to quote, the low FODMAP diet, so this case we're restricting things that feed bacteria. The low FODMAP diet ranked first for abdominal pain severity, abdominal bloating or distension severity, and for bowel habits. So coming back to the analogy of not wanting to micromanage the ecosystem, Let's say you did a stool test. Your healthcare provider said, you're low in Akkermansia, eat more fruits and vegetables. And you were already eating at baseline a decent amount of fruits and vegetables, so you weren't way under the norm of the standard American diet. And you also had gas, bloating, you suspected leaky gut for whatever reason, abdominal pain, loose bowels, constipation. You then start eating more fruits, vegetables, prebiotics, and FODMAPs, and your symptoms get worse. So this would be a good example of where treating a specific lab marker can actually lead you to undertake an intervention that might be the opposite of what's helpful for you. So that point aside, there are other dietary strategies that have also been shown to improve levels of Akkermansia when a low-calorie diet is combined with exercise. And in the appropriate context, this can be health promoting if someone needs to lose some weight. Now, if someone's underweight, that wouldn't be a good idea. Other research has shown the same for a ketogenic diet or for intermittent fasting, or for the consumption of polyphenols. Now, this comes from animal data, so we should be a little bit bridled, but with the consumption of cranberry extract or Concord grape, they were able to demonstrate, again, an animal model, improvements in Akkermansia due to the polyphenol content. And then lastly, a 2022 randomized control trial found that a lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend probiotic increased Akkermansia levels. So we have a number of strategies here that not everyone needs to do. Not everyone should be ketogenic. Not everyone should be fasting. But the point that I'm trying to make is there are multiple things that you can do to improve Akkermansia, some of which may make you feel good and some of which may flare you. So we want to be careful not to just blindly try to increase levels of one bacteria in the gut absent to your experience. And another way of thinking about this is Akkermansia, like many bacteria in the gut, might be a proxy for host health. Meaning, we take people who don't exercise and we serially assess their microbiome over time. When they start exercising, their microbiome shifts and becomes more diverse and healthier. And they stop exercising and it becomes less diverse. We see the same thing with disruptions of sleep. So I just want to be careful to tie in that concept so that you don't treat the lab markers at the exclusion of listening to your body and using that biofeedback as the best way to determine what therapies work best for you. And this happens all the time where people go low carb and they don't feel well, but they keep doing it, or people go high fiber and they don't feel well and they keep doing it because they're treating a lab value and not listening to their body. Okay, so then a few conclusions regarding Akkermansia muciniphila. It's new, and I think it's interesting. I do have some concerns that it's being misrepresented as a novel gut regulator and the only one that lives in the lining of the gut, that it's a major player in the GI tract, and that it's always low in disease states. I think these are either untrue or misleading. Again, reviewing the data, Akkermansia inferior for blood sugar. It might be better for weight loss and for lipids, although we should be cautious because it's one randomized control trial comparing to meta-analyses of several. And it also appears to be helpful for leaky gut, at least for LPS, but again, based upon one study. And there's no research yet in gastrointestinal conditions like reflux, bloating, IBS, IBD. So with all that said, I do think Akkermansia is worth a trial. I would advise trialing triple therapy probiotic first, or really any probiotic first in the three categories that we often discuss. So we've discussed many a study on the blends of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. That would be a great place to start. That would be a better place to start, in my view, given all of the research on that type of probiotic before Akkermansia. Second to that, if you've used this type of probiotic, I would trial a combination of the lacto and bifido blend plus a soil-based probiotic plus a Saccharomyces probiotic. Why is that? This is our posit, but there are many randomized control trials for each type of these three probiotics. By using them together, again, our hypothesis is the triple therapy, or the three formulas together, is just combining where we have a lot of research and using those three at once synergistically. If you've done that, then I think Akkermansia would be advisable. Now, you could try Akkermansia whenever you want. There's no reason that you couldn't, but just looking at where do we have the best data of healthy outcomes, it would be with the 3 types of probiotics that we've discussed so many times in the past. From there, then a trial on Akkermansia, I think makes sense because good job with the company publishing some papers and doing the science. I want to commend that, but I also want to bridle and be careful that you don't take some of these remarks out of context and think that this is the new and therefore the best probiotic. I think that would be a mistake. If you do try Akkermansia, remember that most of the studies are showing benefit within 1 to 3 months. So that would be your time period to assess, is this probiotic helping, yes or no? There's 1 or 2 exceptions to this wherein longer than 3 months may be necessary for constipation specifically and for cognitive impairment. But as a simple practical method of assessing, usually if it's the right fit from a diet perspective, from a probiotic perspective, for many interventions, you'll have a sense that it's working within the first month. But again, I think if you want to be more rigorous, up to 3 months is probably a reasonable interval to then reevaluate, do I feel any better? And that's a really important thing to bear in mind, is that there should be some indication that this is helping you. With that, I hope this has been helpful, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, your comments in the comments section. And otherwise, I hope this helps you make a decision on whether or when you want to trial Akkermansia.